On Florida's Gulf Coast, a young cocaine dealer named Jeffrey Mathis earned a place in criminal infamy that rivals any kingpin, not for the volume of drugs he sold, but for the brazen violence he unleashed. By age 23, Mathis sat atop the Fort Myers beach cocaine trade, running his business from the unlikeliest of headquarters, Andretti's Pizzeria on Estero Boulevard. Tourists stopping in for a slice had no idea the owner was a major drug boss, but locals in the know could order more than pepperoni. Special customers could get cocaine to go out the back of the pizza shop. Jeffrey Mathis was the ultimate double threat, a small-town businessman by day, and by night the armed overlord of a booming beachside coke enterprise. He cultivated an image as a brash, fearless young man. Employees and rivals alike knew him to be volatile and heavily armed. And as Matthews's drug empire grew, so did the body count around Fort Myers. By 1989, a series of murders and shootings linked to local cocaine dealings had made front-page news, a level of violence previously unheard of in the Fort Myers area. Federal agents started paying close attention to the swaggering young dealer holding court at Andretti's. In early 1990, the net began to tighten on Mathis. A joint DEA and Lee County Sheriff's Office investigation, part of the sweeping Operation Peacemaker targeting Southwest Florida smugglers, had infiltrated his crew. Undercover buys and informants pointed to Mathis as a key supplier on Fort Myers Beach. In February 1990, agents finally made their move, raiding Andretti's Pizzeria and carting off boxes of evidence. Mathis, sensing the walls closing in, responded with defiance and fury. He placed menacing phone calls to the local DEA office, threatening to harm agents and destroy property. Investigators didn't know it yet, but the young kingpin was deadly serious. He was prepared to declare war on the U.S. government itself to avoid prison. On March 15, 1990, a federal grand jury indicted Jeffrey Mathis, along with 3 associates, on cocaine distribution and related charges. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Mathis, rather than run or surrender, decided to strike first in the most heinous way imaginable. 2 days later, in the pre-dawn hours of March 17, 1990, terror struck Fort Myers. At approximately 2 a.m., a massive explosion ripped through the DEA field office on New Brittany Boulevard. Mathis had sent a hired accomplice to firebomb the building. The device was cruelly effective, a pipe bomb packed with gunpowder and bullets strapped to a 5-gallon gasoline can. The bomber hurled this makeshift bomb through a window of the DEA office and fled. Moments later, an eruption of fire and shrapnel obliterated the 1-story office. The blast ignited stored ammunition inside. Over 300,000 rounds of bullets began exploding, firing off in all directions. Fueled by the gas, the fireball raged out of control, burning the DEA office to the ground within minutes. The fire was so intense that firefighters couldn't even approach. Live rounds were popping like a war zone, and the night sky lit up red for miles around. It was the first time in U.S. history that a Drug Enforcement Administration office had been bombed on American soil. The audacity of the act made national headlines and turned the spotlight squarely on Fort Myers. Miraculously, and by design, no one was killed in the bombing, because it occurred in the middle of the night when the office was empty. But the message was clear. Jeff Mathis was willing to do anything to avoid capture. After the bombing, Mathis vanished into the wind. He had stocked a personal arsenal and vowed he would never be taken alive. With a federal office in ruins and a violent fugitive on the loose, law enforcement's response was immediate and overwhelming, with the FBI stepping in to lead the manhunt. An additional 150 federal agents and SWAT team members flooded Lee County to assist. A nationwide alert went out for Mathis, whose tactics now resembled those of a hardened terrorist. Authorities feared he might target individuals next. Judges, prosecutors, and witnesses tied to the case were placed under armed protection. Federal marshals with rifles stood guard outside the courthouse in Fort Myers. Bomb squads swept buildings before investigators entered any property linked to Mathis. The young drug dealer had effectively declared war, and the government was in an all-out battle to stop him. For 3 tense weeks, Jeffrey Mathis managed to elude capture. Rumors swirled about where he might be hiding. He had ties to Jacksonville and was known to disguise himself. But in early April 1990, a critical lead broke the case. Investigators traced a phone call Mathis made to a friend in Jacksonville, which led them to a payphone outside an Orlando hotel. There, on April 7, 1990, FBI agents and U.S. Marshals descended and caught Mathis by surprise as he hung up the receiver. The 23-year-old who had terrorized Fort Myers was arrested without a shot fired. His vow to never be taken alive went unfulfilled. As news of his capture spread, a sigh of relief went up from the law enforcement community and Fort Myers residents alike. The Fort Myers bombers' short-lived reign of terror was over. In custody, faced with an ironclad case, Mathis eventually made a deal rather than face a potential death sentence. In October 1990, he pleaded guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise and to involvement in an execution-style murder that, according to federal and state court records, Mathis ordered on a man who had begun cooperating with federal agents investigating his operation. With the help of 2 corrupt Lee County deputies on his payroll, Mathis learned the informant's schedule and movements. One night, he and an associate set up a fake roadblock along the victim's route home from work. When the car stopped, they approached and shot the man in the head at close range, killing him instantly. The plea bargain spared his life, but assured he'd never taste freedom again. Jeffrey Mathis was sentenced to life in federal prison without parole. Additionally, he pleaded guilty to multiple Florida state charges, including 2 second-degree murders and accessory to murder, which were linked to a search of his property, where investigators unearthed a padlocked freezer chest buried in mudflats near his house. Inside, they found a decomposed body, another victim Mathis had murdered and hidden away. These charges drew 3 more 30-year sentences, to be served concurrently with his life term. In effect, Mathis was buried under life plus 100 years, a clear message that attacking U.S. agents and killing witnesses would be punished to the maximum. Jeffrey Mathis today remains in a maximum security prison, a middle-aged man who will never walk free. The small-town coke dealer, who turned into a one-man insurgency, forced authorities to recognize that the drug war had front lines even in suburban America. While Miami was awash in cocaine cash, across the peninsula another drug was wreaking havoc in the 1980s: crack cocaine. In the city of St. Petersburg on Florida's Gulf Coast, a man nicknamed Wonderman became the first infamous crack kingpin, pioneering an empire that turned quiet neighborhoods into war zones. Robert Earl Lee, known on the streets as Wonderman, rose to power as crack flooded St. Pete's neighborhoods in the mid to late 80s. He wasn't just a dealer, he was a local crime lord whose name was spoken with a mix of fear and, by his crew, reverence. The man they called Wonderman was in charge of this organization, a federal prosecutor later said of Lee's operation, and that organization was colossal in its day. By 1989, at the height of the crack epidemic, St. Petersburg saw record murder rates, 44 homicides that year, the most in city history. Much of that violence, officials said, was tied directly to crack crews like Wonderman's. When authorities finally took him down, they estimated the Lee family had already made millions of dollars peddling crack. The profits were so immense that the young kingpin grew careless with his cash. Lee once lost $30,000 in cash because he forgot he'd stashed it in a garbage can, and the money got thrown out. Such was the fast and loose, lavish lifestyle of Wonderman. Money pouring in so fast that tens of thousands could literally end up in the trash. Lee's crack empire extended through a network of relatives and associates. He and his brother, Roy Larry Lee, effectively turned selling rock cocaine into a family franchise. Open-air drug markets sprang up in neighborhoods like Bartlett Park, operating around the clock. Community residents lived in terror of the violence that accompanied the trade. Shootings, turf disputes, intimidation of witnesses. Police alleged that Wonderman and his crew would do whatever it took to protect their lucrative franchise. By the late 80s, he was the #1 target for local narcotics detectives. In early 1989, law enforcement launched a sweeping crackdown and shut him down. That year, Robert Wonderman Lee and several members of his organization were arrested after a complex investigation. It was the end of St. Petersburg's first crack dynasty. In 1990, Wonderman and his brother Roy were both sentenced to life in prison for their narcotics conspiracy. The community, plagued by years of bloodshed, could finally breathe a sigh of relief as the Lee brothers were let off in chains. But the fall of Wonderman Lee left a power vacuum, one that would soon be filled by his one-time protege and enforcer, Ronald Romeo Mathis. As the 1990s began, the crack trade in St. Pete was about to enter an even more organized and deadly phase under Romeo's reign.
I had 3 groups of people supplying me with drugs because one group was not able to supply me with enough drugs. We was moving that much drugs every week.
Well, how much were you moving?
We was averaging 300,000 a week.
When Wonderman Lee fell in 1989, the throne of St. Petersburg's crack trade didn't sit empty for long. His one-time protege, Ronald Eugene Romeo Mathis, stepped up to become the new kingpin of Pinellas County. Mathis had been just a cog in the Lee operation, a mid-level dealer, learning the tricks of the trade under Wonderman's tutelage. But once the Lees were gone, Romeo Mathis built his own empire that in some ways outdid his mentors. He transformed the retail crack business into a well-oiled machine, reputedly far more sophisticated and regimented than his predecessors. According to law enforcement, Mathis's organization sold crack in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, like a McDonald's staying open round the clock. He had crews working morning, afternoon, and graveyard shifts to ensure there was never a moment a desperate customer couldn't find a rock. At its peak, Mathis's drug network was bringing in an estimated $300,000 every week in revenue, roughly $15 million a year in street-level sales. This was an extraordinary volume for localized dealing, essentially turning entire neighborhoods into open-air drug markets. Residents were terrified. Mathis' crew enforced their dominance with guns and intimidation, and the constant flow of customers brought violence and chaos. One raid later revealed Mathis even had lookouts with radios and a posted schedule for dealers, underscoring how organized it was. Authorities likened it to a major corporation in its structure. By late 1991, the Romeo Mathis crack syndicate had become target number 1 for St. Petersburg police and the DEA. A series of coordinated busts known as Another Sweep finally went down in November 1991. SWAT teams hit multiple locations, rounding up Mathis's lieutenants and soldiers. The dragnet closed in on Romeo himself. In the Bartlett Park neighborhood, a crowd of long-suffering residents gathered on the sidewalks as officers led a handcuffed Mathis out of his hideout. These residents had endured the reign of terror, the 24/7 drug dealing, the drive-by shootings, and the constant fear. And now they literally cheered at the sight of the kingpin in custody. It was a carnival-like atmosphere, neighbors clapping and shouting thanks to the police, celebrating that their streets might finally be safe again. Mathis didn't cower or hide his face. Instead, with a defiant smirk, he promised the crowd, "I'll be back."
You see, they had gave me 6 life sentences in 140 years. And the judge had guaranteed everybody that I would never see the outside of prison again.
The quote made the local news, a smiling, handcuffed Romeo vowing that this wasn't the end for him. It was a bold, almost cinematic moment, as if he believed his criminal saga was only at intermission. His arrest marked the collapse of the last major crack monopoly in St. Petersburg. In 1993, federal prosecutors went a step further by indicting Mathis on murder charges as well, accusing him of ordering the execution-style killing of a rival dealer, Antoine Tony Alexander, in March 1990. This was part of a strategy to seek the federal death penalty against Mathis under the drug kingpin capital statutes, which allowed death for murders committed in furtherance of a continuing criminal enterprise. It was extremely rare for a drug dealer's case to become a capital case, highlighting how much carnage Mathis had caused. He pleaded not guilty and prepared to fight for his life. However, in mid-1994, before a death penalty trial could commence, Mathis struck a deal. He pleaded guilty to avoid capital prosecution and was instead sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole in federal court. At just about 30 years old, Ronald Romeo Mathis would spend the remainder of his days behind bars. About 30 of his former associates were also convicted on drug conspiracy charges during the crackdown, many receiving hefty sentences themselves. The Mathis organization was utterly dismantled. Its $300,000 a week drug revenue stream dried up, its boss condemned to a cell. Mathis ultimately served decades in prison. After roughly 30 years locked up, there were reports in 2021 of his sentence being reduced and him re-entering society, finding God and even a pulpit to preach from. A twist few could have predicted during his bloody heyday.